Water has one of the weirder spreads of support in Rhea cluster. While most colors were split between defined archetypes and followed a single gimmick or playstyle, Water was split between three very different rulers, two of which I'm hesitant to even call water-based at all. IU is a J-ruler-centric deck that doesn't fit with the rest of Water's identity in the cluster. Even if most of her direct support is in attribute, the way it's used is typically not reliant on being played. Witch is a bit more in line with Water, but her versatility and easy color fixing means she benefits more from going into other colors, with the vast majority of Witch decks only using Water as their secondary. These two rulers had very minuscule amounts of printed support, IU because of her playstyle, and Witch because she was released in the last set of the cluster. This leaves the bulk of Water and Rhea cluster dedicated to Shayla. There are roughly 3 Shayla archetypes: Mermaids, Rain, and Thunderstorm. I'm mostly focusing on Mermaids for this video, but I'll cover the other two as they come up since there's a decent amount of overlap between these 3 gimmicks. To get started, let's take a look at Shayla, a 3-cost judgment ruler with the following effects. The weather is Rain during your turn. Rest. Search your deck for a card named Weather Change Rain and add it to your hand. Shayla received a retrain in the 3rd set of the cluster that added 1 new ability to her ruler side. During your turn, and once per turn, you may put an electricity counter on this card, or remove an electricity counter from this card. If you do, the weather is Thunderstorm until the end of the turn. Shayla's original gimmick was Rain, a game state that did nothing outside of alter how some of her spells and cards interacted with each other. Most of these effects are simple stat changes, and Shayla naturally gains these benefits on her turn, but can access them on her opponent's turn with cards like Weather Change Rain or by banishing her special magic stone. Thunderstorm works similarly to Rain, being a change that only benefits the player's board state by empowering their cards. These benefits are typically similar to Rain, but slightly souped up. I don't want to spend a long time on Weather Change, but there are a few important things to know about it. For starters, Weather Change only affects the player using the weather-altering card or ability, so in a Shayla mirror, only the turn player gets the actual benefits of the card. Second, Rain and Thunderstorm are not the same thing. Weather being Thunderstorm does not also trigger Rain effects, and only one weather state can be active at a time. So if you're going to remove a counter to make it Thunderstorm, make sure you've used up all the benefits of it being Rain first, since you can't go back without using another card effect. Shayla's J-ruler side is the Mermaid Princess, a 10/12 body with the following effects. The weather is Rain. When this card enters the field, draw a card. Active. The weather is Thunderstorm until the end of the turn. And then God's Art Indignation. 1 water and remove 2 electricity counters from this card. Destroy target J-Resonator. Rest all resonators your opponent controls. Needless to say, the J-Ruler is a pretty big upgrade over the Ruler, being able to freely change the Rain on either player's turn and gain whatever benefits you need on your resonators on either player's turns. Her God's Art is one of the cheapest forms of J-Ruler destruction in the game. Her post-update form gave her a lot of utility, boosting her from Fringe unplayable to Rogue. She's solid as a ruler and can easily support her gimmick without having to jump through hoops to do so. But her viability rests squarely on how strong her cards are against other hard hitters. Getting into 1 cost, our first resonator is Shayla's Attendant, a 3/3 water resonator that gains 2/2 if the weather is Rain. A 5/5 on offense and a 3/3 on defense is pretty fair and simplistic for a 1-cost card. Attendant isn't bad so much as it doesn't provide enough benefits to stand out like other 1-drops in other colors. The next 1-cost is Angelic Voice Mermaid, a 3/3 that draws a card on enter if the weather is Rain. Weaker in stats but stronger in utility, Angelic Voice Mermaid comes with a decent effect for body trade-off that puts her ahead of most other draw card resonators of the time. The Rain limitation doesn't mean much if you're running Shayla, and she can easily fuel certain chants that require you to have multiple mermaids on the field to resolve. I feel like this one is a staple in Shayla if you're structuring your deck entirely around fish ladies. The last 1-cost is Mermaid Visionary, a 0/3 body that draws a card when it's sent from the field to the graveyard. An arguably weaker version of Angelic, Visionary falls into the category of pack filler and exists to fit limited playstyles like Draft or Sealed instead of Constructed. Her stats and effect really don't line up with the other 2 mermaid options, making her a weak outlier. Moving to 2 costs, first is Shayla's Elite, a 6/6 that searches a Mermaid Resonator other than another elite from your deck and adds it to the hand. A pretty standard searcher if I ever saw one. Elite helps tempo into turn 3 plays by grabbing whatever you might need while providing a decent body. Most of the stronger Mermaids are 3 or 4 costs, so this is a decent turn 2 play to try and respond to whatever your opponent is doing in hopes of disrupting them next turn. I really wish this had a benefit when it was raining, such as putting the Resonator into the field if it was 2 cost or less, but this is just another fair and generic Resonator with no real standout quirks. Next is Dr. Mermaid. She is a 4/7 mermaid with 2 effects. Rest, remove all damage from target Resonator, or Rest, recover your ruler if it's water. Dr. Mermaid's specializations are niche at best. Removing damage is a decent enough way to play around certain combat tricks, but most of the time if something is taking damage, it's going to be enough to kill it. The recovery effect allows Shayla to call a stone and then cast Judgment or search for a Weather Change Rain in the same turn. But Weather Change is a rare to run card in your typical Thunderstorm deck as Shayla, since you rarely want to have the weather be raining instead of thundering. Outside of Shayla, this really only serves to give ramp into Judgment advantage since no other water ruler in the format has a Rest to activate skill. Mefina, Thundercloud Wizard, is a 6/6 mermaid that causes any weather change effect you control to automatically make a Thunderstorm instead. Mefina is a card that turns Shayla into Thunderstorm.deck, but her effect isn't always beneficial. While Thunderstorm undoubtedly has stronger abilities tied to it, you typically want to tempo into Thunderstorm effects while making use of Rain on the first few turns. On top of that, Shayla has enough reliable ways to control the weather to her liking that Mefina acts more like a vanilla 6/6 than anything. Her one sort of saving grace is a convoluted combo with our next 2 cost, Silent Mermaid. She's yet another 6/6 with the effect that your opponent cannot respond to cards and effects you use on your own turn, as long as the weather is Thunderstorm. Silent Mermaid is almost an OTK enabler, or rather a safety net for them. Stopping all responses allows for riskier plays on your turn, which can lead into hard-to-break fields or lethal damage depending on what you play. Generally, you want to make the weather Thunderstorm and then play Mermaid to minimize your opponent's responses, but this eats into your resources and can force you into smaller plays on later turns. The last 2 cost is Crier Mermaid, a 4/5 that prevents all damage it receives until the end of the turn when it blocks. It also gains an additional 2/2 if the weather is rain. I'm not really a fan of how at odds these 2 effects are, one being a defensive wall buff while the other is really only usable on offense, but I guess it gives the card some diversity in its uses. This card has a variant version that flips the attack and defense and prevents the damage on attacking instead of blocking. This is arguably one of the few variants that feels worthwhile to play and makes much better use of its printed abilities than the original. Being able to reach 700 attack on player turn and prevent damage after swinging can lead to a lot of cheeky pickoffs on other 2 or 3 cost threats. Let's move on to the 3 cost mermaids, the first of which is Aqua Rifle. She's a 7/7 body that rests a Resonator when she enters the field and returns it to the hand instead if the weather is rain. She fits in pretty well with the mid-rangey style mermaids seem to be going for. Compared to other 3 costs at the time, she is severely lacking though. A 7/7 isn't exactly the best in terms of stats, meaning her usefulness is tied almost exclusively to her one-time effect. Coral Reef Mermaid is like the inverse of Aqua Rifle. Same stats, same cost, but instead of bouncing when she enters, she does it when she's sent from the field to the graveyard. I find both of these to be pretty underwhelming, and there are better plays you can make on turn 3 other than these 2. Guard at the Coral Palace is another 3 cost mermaid with 4/12 for stats, and the effect to let you look at the top card of your deck and then put it on the top or bottom of your deck whenever it attacks or blocks. 1200 defense makes Guard pretty hard to kill in combat, but there are plenty of other avenues you can take to completely bypass that. Getting to peek at your top card wasn't very strong during Rhea Cluster, and it's only slightly better now because there are a few cards that can make use of it. Much like Rifle and Coral Reef, there are plenty of better 3 cost options than Guard available, and she's rather underwhelming. Mermaid Researcher is a 7/7 3 cost that lets you choose a race on enter, and then allow you to rest Researcher to boost another Resonator of that selected race by 2/2 until the end of the turn. This thing is draft filler if I ever saw it. Pitiful stats, gimmicky, non-archetypal effect, and an in general just kind of crummy effect that makes her one of the worst out of all the disappointing mermaid cards. If she could boost all resonators of that race instead of just one, she'd probably make for a decent splash card, since she could potentially give an extra 400 attack in one turn if used before and after your recovery step. The last of the 3-cost mermaids is Praying Mermaid, an 8/8 that turns the weather to thunderstorms at the start of each of your turns until the end of the turn. This really isn't mermaid support so much as it is allowing other decks to use thunderstorm support. If Shayla really needs thunderstorm, she has plenty of other options that are cheaper and easier to use. Alright, we're in the home stretch and nearing the 3000th word on this word count, so let's start with the 4-cost Wave Rider Mermaid. A 10/10 that gains an additional 2/2 in flying while the weather is rain, and can pay 2 water to rest a target resonator while it's raining. This is the main boss of all the mermaid resonators. She has decent stats for a cost, gains a good symbol skill on the player's turn, and can rest potential blockers or even attackers if you can make it rain during your opponent's turn. She's not a godsend, but she's kind of the best we have to work with in Tribal. The other mermaid boss is Swirling Mermaid, a 5-cost 10/10 that can't be blocked as long as the weather is rain, and can rest something once per turn for 2 water. Now where have I seen this card before? Swirling Mermaid is arguably just a worse version of Wave Rider. Unblockability doesn't mean too much when your deck has so many bounce and rest effects that it's a miracle if your opponent actually gets to block with anything at all. The real kicker is that a card with this same effect, stats, and unblockability effect was released with a lower cost in the exact same set. And that card also came with a tutor spell that grants it swiftness, and the only caveat is that it needs to be thunderstorm instead of raining. Swirling Mermaid really got the shaft, and unless you figure out a way to recover her multiple times, it really isn't going to be worth it to run her over Wave Rider. So, Rhea Cluster was not the origin of mermaids, and a few of them were actually in sets before it, with a healthy amount of them actually making up a chunk of the original 3 Valhalla sets. As such, New Valhalla reintroduced a couple of them as a cute throwback. First is Mermaid of the Misty Spring, a 2-cost 2/8 that lets you 4C one card at the end of each turn. For those of you unaware, 4C is the same effect as Royal Guard. It lets you look at the top X number of cards on your deck, and then you can put any number of them back on top or bottom of your deck. Misty Spring lets you know what your next draw is going to be the turn before it happens, and doesn't do much else. The 2/8 stat line is cute, but you aren't going to be pressuring much on block with that low attack stat. Antarite, Sealed God of the Riverbed, is a much better mermaid support card than her 2-cost underling. She's a 3-cost 9/7 that gives all other mermaid resonators you control 400 attack, but minus 200 defense. This turns Misty Spring into an on-curve 6/6, but the real benefit here is with Shayla's mermaids who can already gain stat boost when the weather is rain. Attendant becomes a 9/3, Variant Crier becomes an 11/4, and Wave Rider is now a 16/10. If there was an effective way to give mermaid swiftness, this would probably make them one of the scariest water decks because of their insane stat lines. Antarite is a step in the right direction for Tribal, and it's a shame we probably won't see any more mermaids to work with her before Shayla rotates out next cluster. Since water is so heavily skewed towards Shayla, I'm only going to cover chants that state in their text they require a mermaid or Shayla to gain benefits on the field. So no Shayla's Return, Shayla's Battle, or Berry Berry. Those all fit under generic water support or thunderstorm support. With that in mind, there are 4 cards that directly benefit from having either Shayla or a mermaid out, with most of them being released in Ancient Knights. The first card, Song of Sympathy, is a 4-cost water chant that requires you to control at least 2 mermaids to be played. Its effect is pretty simple. Take control of target resonator. A bit costly but strong for what it does, Song of Sympathy lets you permanently gain control of whatever you want. Barrier pending. Which means you can mess up your opponent's late game plays if you're up against the right deck. The inherent weakness of Mermaids and Shayla as a ruler when this card was released, along with the amount of counters and responses, made Song an unreliable thing that wasn't worth using in a format where Priscilla was still taking matches on turn 2. Even though the pace of the game has slowed down since then, the steep price of the card makes it hard to recommend, especially when a lot of decks now either run ways to protect or remove their resonators from the field and avoid being hit by something like this. Our next card is Shayla's Foresight, a 2-cost quick cast chant with the following effects. Pick 1. If your J/ruler is Shayla, you may pick up to 3 instead. Put target attacking resonator on top of its owner's deck. Put target addition on top of its owner's deck. Target player shuffles all magic stones from their graveyard into their magic stone deck, and then shuffles all cards from their graveyard into the deck. Draw a card. I enjoy things that give you options outside of just doing one thing, and Foresight takes it to the extreme. By just having Shayla, you now have a card that not only removes something from the field, but also can force a wipe on your opponent's grave and potentially replace it at instant speed. This is pretty good in a meta where a lot of the top decks are relying on additions and graveyard shenanigans to get their plays going, and it gives Shayla a lot of viability as a mid-rangey tempo deck, even if her current preferred style is something closer to aggro. Last of the ECN Mermaid chants is Seabed Investigation. For 2 water, you can look at the top 4 cards of your deck and put one of them into your hand, then put the rest on the bottom. If you control a mermaid, you can add up to 2 cards instead. Seabed is a card that's good in Shayla, but not much else. I said in a previous video that when using things with replacement effects, you typically also want it to provide some other kind of benefit, especially if it requires resources like multiple stones. +1 in hand size is a pretty good trade-off for 2 will, especially if you're playing a Thunderstorm or Keys variant of Shayla that pops off on turn 3. But there are several other draw and search options in Mermaid Tribal that make Investigation a 2 of at best, maybe 3 if your locals all play Lucifer control like a bunch of assholes. The last of the Mermaid support cards is Path We Part, a fire-water chant that has its cost reduced by 1 fire if your J/ruler is Shayla, and by 1 water if your J/ruler is Kirik. This is a staple card in Kirik, and it is also a staple card in Shayla. Path We Part gives benefits outside of both colors' respective identities. 600 damage for 1 lets you trade up with most 2-cost cards, and being able to bounce anything at instant speed lets you get around pesky blockers or force activate effects from your opponent's resonators when they otherwise not want to use them. This card is really good. I don't know what else to say. Run 4. Putting together and testing a deck specifically for mermaids was a bit of a challenge. Despite them having solid resonators at almost every step of the game, none of them can really push through like Giga Thunderfish or any of the more recent machine resonators. Mermaids seem to have been designed as a slower deck, one that builds up steam over time and goes into a wide but cost-efficient board mid-game rather than ramming over and over again like you see with Thunderstorm variants. If you want to see an in-depth look at one of those, I would suggest looking up one of the other various Force of Will channels, as surely one of them has covered the few Shayla decks that have topped at the smaller GPs or at least made top 16. I'll add a Thunderstorm list in the description though, just to cover all my bases. Back on topic, our 1-cost resonators are pretty easily decided between Angelic Voice and Shayla's Attendant. If you want a more aggressive style deck, you can throw in Soaked Panda since it gains a hefty attack boost depending on if the weather is rain or thunderstorm, or Yorgmunder if you want some options in your mid-game plays and potential ending swings. As for 2 costs, you want 4 Elite since it can search out just about anything in your deck, mostly Antirite, since she makes your whole field scary, and either Crier Mermaid or the variant if you can find it. Like I said, I'm a bigger fan of the variant because it gives you an unkillable attacker, but having the unkillable blocker is fine too. Assuming your opponent doesn't actually use other removal cards. 3 costs should definitely be 4 of Antirite. She's our pseudo game ender in Tribal thanks to her boost, and Garmheld isn't that bad to have as maybe a 2 or 3 of. Most of my testing for this video came before New Valhalla 3 released, but I don't see how ramp could be a bad thing for any deck, especially one with as many replacement and search effects as Mermaids. Wave Rider is your main boss. She's 1 less than Swirling, doesn't have a once per turn restriction on her rest ability, and the no blocking effect is outweighed by the fact that Shayla has so many battle traps you should never be able to expect to block her anyways. Other good non-mermaid bosses include Misty Dragon, Fenrir, and Mosasaurus. You could probably throw together an entire hard control deck for Mosa, but I don't know if Shayla is necessarily the best ruler for that style of play, but I'll add one anyways for those curious. I really like mermaids, even if I don't think they're particularly powerful. Shayla was no doubt shafted by the fact her support was split amongst so many archetypes, and it's a little painful to think that if the 3 Thunderfish cards had been changed into mermaids instead, that Anime Ariel over here could have had one of the most scary and consistent aggro decks of late Rhea format. Instead, what we got was a bunch of weird one-off deck types with minimal support and generic pack filler that doesn't really help Shayla or mermaids work in any effective way. This is the problem with trying to design multiple gimmicks around one particular archetype or card. One of them is always going to outweigh the others. Control Shayla and Aggro Shayla are never going to be able to share the spotlight at the same time, and one is always going to be mechanically favored over the other.